so happy to see so many people here today. And this is the second year that Leslie Carson and I have been in charge of these book reviews. And I just cannot say enough about what Leslie has done. She's very active. She comes in January. She's very active in her own chapter. And she manages to do two things. And we've worked very hard the last 2 years. And we hope that you've enjoyed it. And of course, this is the first of the series that you've just shown, and I hope you come back to that. So, I would first like to say, behind every great man, there is a great woman. And so, I would like to introduce my friend, and a very competent educator, past mother. At present, she is working with the youth at the First Baptist Church, and does a phenomenal job, and she has a lot of things to do, and I would like to say welcome to Hayden, the son, who has given up his day to come and hear his dad talk. And so, as you know, that's a very special thing. So, thank you again for being here, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Christina.
That's very kind. My husband and I met in 1997, and we've been doing ministry together since we were dating, and this is the very first time I've ever introduced him. So it kind of feels a little funny because it has a lot to do with me and him. But we met in 1997 at Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach. He was a religion major, I was an education major. He graduated 1 year ahead of me, so when I graduated in 2001, we moved up to Atlanta for him to go to school at Mercer University, Matthew School of Theology, for his master's degree. And then we thought we'd come back to Florida, but God had other plans, and we were there for 15 years, and he ended up getting his doctorate of ministry there as well. And during that time, I was teaching school, and we had our children. We have an 18-year-old daughter, and then our son, who is 14. And during that time in Atlanta, we pastored a church for 13 years in Conyers, Georgia, just southeast of Atlanta. And I also worked with children's ministry there and was teaching full-time. And then now we're here in Vero. We've been here since 2016 doing ministry together again here in Vero Beach. And I do children's ministry and, of course, senior pastor. And it's just been a wonderful time and growing together. And one of the things that's been a theme all the way through has been women in ministry. And as a woman in ministry, it can be tough sometimes. And I've always had the support of my husband. Like, you know, he lets me fight my battles on my own, but he's always there behind me. He's always been supportive of that. And that's been important for our family, especially having a daughter, empowering her in her life too. So with that, Reverend Dr. Cody.
Thank you for having me here today. It's such a privilege to be with you all, and it's great. Jane has talked about this group for so long, for as long as I've known her, and she invited me to a few meetings, and I've missed them, unfortunately. I'm sorry. And it's such a great day to be here with you, and I thank you for that. One of the first things you'll notice about Beth Barr's book is that it starts autobiographical. Because what we have learned over the years is that when we talk about the Bible or religion or theology, we really have to start with ourselves. No one comes to the Bible with a clean slate. And every person, every tradition, every theologian reads the Bible through a lens of their upbringing and their culture. John Wesley simplified it into 4 aspects that really inform who we are when we read the Bible and when we do theology. By the way, if you've ever thought about God, you're a theologian. Theologians aren't just those, dudes who sit up in ivory towers. We're all theologians. If we make a judgment or make a conclusion or have convictions or values, either with God or without God, you are a theologian in the making. John Wesley simplified that and said that there are really 4 aspects simply that inform how we read the Bible. It starts with Scripture, of course, our approach to Scripture. And then it goes to tradition, and really, what is our tradition? I'm talking about women in ministry. If you have other religious traditions represented, it may not even be an issue. I know First Baptist Church is surrounded by at least 3 churches in the area that all have women on staff, women pastors. a senior pastor who was a woman. First time they had a woman as a senior pastor in their history. So really, it's a topic that not a lot of people talk about, but in Baptist life, it has become very important to us and my family with that. I did not grow up Southern Baptist. I actually grew up in Staten Island, New York, with an evangelical family with two very independent, strong, and sisters who were really my mentors and in many ways my hero. The one sister pictured here is the one with whom I lived and grew up with, Gina. She was always someone I was looking up to. She's a reader and a writer. She became an editor-in-chief, and I was very always very proud of her and always wanted to be like my big sister. So whenever growing up in this kind of context in an Italian household, if you're Italian, you know the mamas and the sisters are strong, independent individuals, and that's how I grew up. When I started to assert my own faith, I started to attend a Presbyterian church in Pompano Beach that affirmed women in ministry. The Evangelical Presbyterian Church was a church that had women elders, women deacons, and for me, that wasn't an issue. When I went into the church and I saw both men and women represented in leadership, I didn't think twice about it. I grew up in a household that affirmed women. My sister was one of the first cousins to go to college, among the cousins to go to college, NYU, and so for me it was not really a big deal. But then I started to get into Baptist life when at Palm Beach Atlantic, where I really had to make a decision on whether I was going to be a Presbyterian or a Baptist minister. And studied the Presbyterian polity and different things, and decided, based on mentors at that time, and in conversation with my pastor, that I was going to attend a Baptist seminary. And then I learned that there are different types of Baptist seminaries. Some Baptist seminaries do not affirm women in ministry, and some do, Southern Baptist seminaries. And I had a representative and a mentor who talked to me about Mackie School of Theology and Mercer, that not only really is inclusive of women in ministry and affirms women in ministry, but it's very multicultural. A large portion of our studentry is not only women, but people of color. And I wanted to be in that. My church in Pompano Beach was very multicultural. And so going to a seminary that I felt would not affirm, say, my sisters, if they ever wanted to become pastors, or my hoped-for daughter, was not something that was in the cards. And it continued to be a point of conversation for us and values in our household. And then in 2016, we stumbled upon First Baptist Church of Vero Beach, which does affirm women in ministry. And I was glad to be a part of it now. But that upbringing and that experience and background really shapes how I read Scripture. And I think what's important about Barr's book is she untangles the conversation of women in ministry from the politics and the long heritage of theology, which she calls patriarchy, that has really blurred our reading of Scripture and our approach to ministry. And as we get into the book, she turns from autobiography to trying to help people see that apart from how we read the Bible, is the proof is in the pudding of the historical and biblical evidence of the inclusion of women in ministry. Some of this I have here is not necessarily included in her book, but some of how we read Scripture. And you ask the question, what does the Hebrew Christian Scripture say about women? Well, in the Old Testament, right in Genesis, theologians, if you again unpack the language and untangle it from the theology in the last 500 years, and Barr talks about that heritage of theology and reading the Bible, and how it shifted in medieval and after the Protestant Reformation, you see that in Genesis there is equality. God creates humankind, male and female, in God's image He creates them. And it's male and female that fully incorporates and portrays God's image. And when you go into the second chapter in Genesis, God sees that Adam is alone, and it's not good for Adam to be alone, and so God creates Eve as a helpmate. And what we see in the helpmate is a lot of people think that's a subordinate position, that there's Adam and then Eve is his submissive helpmate. But the word helpmate is used for God, who serves Israel. So if you go out throughout Scripture and you read that word helpmate, It is used as a title for God's role in Israel's life. God is a helpmate of Israel. So if you're willing to put God in a submissive position, I would encourage you to look at the language of that. And then another word is that of cleaving. We often think when it says that the man cleaved to his wife, we think of it in sexual terms. But again, the language does not attest to that. Cleaving is a partnership. David and Jonathan are said to have cleaved together as friends. Ruth and Naomi are said to have cleaved together as partners. So when you look at the language surrounding the very creation narratives of men and women, you see an equality there, not only in the roles that they play, but also in the co-partnership, in which both of them are commissioned by God to care for creation, to be in harmony with creation, and to build a family, and to raise a family that ultimately cares for and co-cares for, partners with God in that caring of creation. The covenants throughout Scripture affirm that, and we see women take an important place within Scripture. Deborah, for instance, is not only described as a prophet, but also as an executor and a commander. She tells Barak how to go about battle and how to negotiate the politics of her day. It says that she's the judge. This is in Judges. Deborah is a judge of Israel. She's a prophet, but she's also the executive. She wields power and authority over the men in her circle. And we see, if you read the text and you see her song, that she's also a very great tactician. She's a wonderful tactician and a wonderful strategist. We also see women playing an important part in Exodus, where the midwives are the heroes in the story. You may remember Pharaoh says, kill all the firstborn children of the Hebrews. The Hebrews are becoming too large of a population, kill all the firstborn. And the Jewish midwives, who are named, which is very unusual for a sacred text to name women in their text, are named as heroes in the story. Then you can continue to go on through the history of Israel, such as the queen mothers, Esther, Ruth, Naomi, and the like. There are prophets in Scripture. Hilda, who wields authority over her community. Hilda is a prophetess. She only gets about 5 or 6 scriptures, but she does have authority, and we see that authority carried out to Jesus' day. Jesus demonstrates that his intention is to make things right that went wrong in Eden. And you remember Eden? That's where the sin happened. They disobeyed God, they ate the fruit, so on and so forth. It is when they sin, Adam and Eve sin and disobey God, that the relationship gets out of balance. So God says the consequence, this is in Genesis 3, the consequence for your sin is that your relationship will no longer be an equal partnership, but one of competition. You'll always be competing with one another. And then sure enough, Genesis 4, Abel and Cain are competitive, and what happens there? Cain kills Abel. At a competitive spirit. The violence just explodes from there. What happens is when Jesus comes, he seeks to right those relationships and to put things back in balance. And you see because of that Jesus practices a very inclusive ministry. He includes women in his entourage. Women are there not only helping with his movement, but they're also there proclaiming good news. They're the first to give the message that Jesus rose from the dead. Women are included in community when Jesus heals women and talks to women, includes women, affirms them. He protects women by reminding the men that you shouldn't get a divorce whenever you want. So whenever you read about divorce and Jesus' words on divorce, remember that's there to protect the women who had no voice, who were vulnerable. Jesus goes one step further in affirming children. When Jesus says, suffer not the children, let them come unto me, that was very controversial. Children were not only not to be heard, but not seen. And you have to understand that women, children, and slaves in that day and age did not have a place at the table. They did not have a voice. Their place was in the privacy of the home, but Jesus not only gives women a voice, but gives them a place of proclamation and of inclusion. Women, children, and those who were marginalized, like those who were not well, the lepers and I say tax collectors and sinners. It's always hard to preach that Jesus gets picked on by the Pharisees for eating with tax collectors and sinners, because Gerald Jean Jordan is often in our crowd. So I have to say, it's a little different than back then than it is now, So that's kind of a running joke at First Baptist Church. We see it in the early church that people actually took Jesus' words seriously. Now you think that's normal, but that's not normal. I meet a lot of Christians who don't take Jesus' words seriously. It's part of why I'm the pastor, is to help people realize that if you're going to call yourself a Christ follower, you need to take Jesus seriously. But they did take Jesus seriously. And when you read Acts and Paul's letters, you see that everyone was included at the table. Men, women, children, slaves. And it was unusual in that time for slaves, say, to eat with masters, or for wives to eat with husbands. But in that early church, that was the way that they did church. And you see that in Corinthians, for instance. When Paul says, when the women pray and prophesy, which is preaching, when women pray and prophesy in your churches, make sure the women's heads are covered. And later, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, wives, because of the culture, and because of what's happening, remain silent when you're in the middle of a public gathering. But what a lot of people don't read is that a few verses later, Paul tells the men to remain silent when they are not doing what they're supposed to do. Everyone seems to focus on the women being silent. No one ever talks about the men being silent. So I think a fair reading of Scripture, and what I do in my church is as a pastor, I don't tell people how and what to believe. We're Baptists, which means that we do not have a bishop or a creed that determines how people read the Bible. So you can get into our church and there are people who disagree with me, and that's okay. So part of being Baptist is you get to read the Bible on your own. But what I encourage my church to do is read the entire Bible, not just the parts that they like. There are household codes, again, that Barr talks about, like Ephesians 5, which are actually controversial because what Paul does when he talks about men and women working together, it's for public evangelism. And what's important is that he addresses women in the first place. And not only does he address women, he addresses women before he addresses the men. And again, this puts them in an equal setting. So though it says, wives, submit to your husbands, the fact that he's talking to wives elevates them because he says after that, husbands, love your wives. So they're on equal footing. And Bibles like to, if you read Barr closely, you'll see that Bibles like to skew this by putting those little summary headings between verses. And for instance, in Ephesians 5, Bibles like to split up Ephesians 5:21, which says, y'all be subservient and submissive to one another. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Well, what some Bibles do, it says, be submissive, y'all one to another. And then it starts a new section where if you're reading it, you see a new section, then you think, wives, submit to your husband, that's the beginning of a new thought. It's not. So when you read Bibles like, for instance, this is the New Testament Modern English. This is a translation in 28, either 28 or 33, by Helen Montgomery, the only Bible to be fully translated by a woman. She served as the first president of the American Baptist, what was the Northern Baptist Convention. Helen Montgomery, she was a Greek scholar, and you see that she gets it right in this Bible. She puts the heading before verse 21 and says split 21 and 22. If you look at church history continues to attest to women in leadership. And if you don't read your history, okay, and you don't read it deeply, you miss the fact that women played an equal part throughout history, even beyond the New Testament. There were bishops, apostles, deacons, pastors. I have some people say, women shouldn't be deacons. So, well, you can argue with God about that, because in Romans 16, you get a whole list of women and men. The Romans 16, the first verse is, welcome Phoebe, a deacon. Now, the Bible doesn't say anything else. It doesn't say slave. It doesn't say deaconess. It says, welcome Phoebe, a deacon. And all you have to do is read Greek, and it says diakonos to read that. And so what we find is that Phoebe is called a deacon. If you go down, it says Junia was reputable among the apostles. A lot of scholars think, well, is she reputable among the 12 apostles, or is she an apostle who is of repute? There's a lot of discussion about that, but the fact that Junia is listed reputable among the apostles. But we also have other people, Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla and Aquila are a pastoral team, but there's something very unusual. Whenever Paul lists Priscilla and Aquila, he always lists Priscilla first. Now that's controversial. In fact, it's so controversial it can get you killed. And there's a reason why Christians were persecuted. It's not because they were handing out food at the soup kitchen. I always tell people, Jesus and the church were persecuted for a reason. Everyone thinks Jesus got killed because he just, he was, what, helping people? No. He was really upturning the entire society, and the early church was. And we see that when Paul talks about, or when Acts talks about Priscilla and Aquila, they named Priscilla first. He names, the author of Acts names Priscilla first. Shows she's a pastor. There are other pastors and leaders of churches. Lydia is listed in Acts. Chloe is listed in the first chapter of Corinthians. And so again, when I talk to a lot of people, they think, oh, women pastors, women deacons, they think it's something new. Like as if the feminists invented it in the 1970s, if I can be so brash. And what we find is that women have always been in the church. Bishops. St. Hildegard of Bingen was a bishop. Everyone know St. Patrick? How many of you know St. Patrick? Raise your hand. I hate to raise the hand thing, don't do it. How about St. Bridget? Does anybody know St. Bridget? Oh, we have a few. St. Bridget was just as influential in evangelizing Ireland as St. Patrick. She was a priest. She was ordained. And people like Anselm, who was a church father, pushed for ordination of women in the priesthood. And many, like Bridget and Hildegard, and so many others, St. Julian Norrick, all of these other women of faith really led communities. The book talks about St. Paula, who helped translate the Bible with St. Jerome, who translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. So everyone talks about Jerome's Latin Vulgate. No, I'm sorry. It's Jerome and Paula's Latin Vulgate. She gets written out of history. There are modern movements. When we talk about history, we have to also talk about where we got from there to here. How did we get to this place where women are relegated and written out of not only history but the Bible? For one, it's a reaction really of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Barr spends a lot of time talking about this in her book, and this is actually a part of history that I did not know. I did not realize the extent at which women were included in the church, and then as a part of that Puritan process of purifying the church and really reestablishing the patriarchy, that the Protestant Reformation, and therefore the Catholic Counter-Reformation, really did harm to advancing and to acknowledging women in ministry. Russell Moore, who was an ethicist of the Southern Baptist Convention before he resigned, because they were trying to force him to be partisan. Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Convention says that this history is plain old patriarchy. You can't clean it up. It's plain old patriarchy. And the fact of the matter is that Protestant Reformation really did a lot of harm because it reestablished the dominancy of men and reestablished modesty as a value and all that goes with it. The other thing is reaction to is the scientific revolution in the ivory tower, in which evolutionary biologists and Darwin made the argument that men were the superior kind of race. Okay, they also incorporated that into race relations, to where people argued that white folks were superior, and that's where you get all kinds of race and gender issues out of the scientific revolution and the ivory tower as a result of that. So our colleges, our churches, built a theological infrastructure that made women subservient, and then our industry, economy, and our intellectuals and the university therefore reinforced that architecture. All right? What's happening today? Well, today, and this goes back to my Baptist roots here, is that there is a big debate within Baptist life. And I have to say Baptist life because it seems like everyone else, like Methodists and Episcopalians, and don't really have an issue with this. But in Baptist, there's still an issue in which the folks who still do not affirm women ministry are called complementary. They say this is a complementary theology in which women and men have roles, but that no woman is to have authority over a man. They use a couple verses, 2 Timothy or 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 13 for that. I would argue against that. That's just me. And the other side of that is what's called egalitarianism. I am promoting today an egalitarian perspective, but there are many people in my church who would promote a complementary perspective. There's a lot there, too much to go into here. But what we find is that complementary, really that perspective is what's driving the kind of the push, at least in Baptist life, for again a subjugation of women. I love how some people in the church say women shouldn't be pastors and leaders, and then all of a sudden, when the Lottie Moon Christmas offering comes up, all of a sudden Lottie Moon is posed as a missionary who basically preached and was a pastor. But when it comes to money, I guess it's okay. All right. Modern movements. We have several heroes here. Lottie Moon, I named as a missionary in the Southern Baptist Convention, who, because she wasn't a man fighting the Civil War, was able to rally Southern Baptist churches and raise money for places like China. She started really that movement of cultural engagement missions, preached, pastored, and still is a firm today. Helen Montgomery, I mentioned, was the first president of the North American Mission, or the North American Baptist Convention in the 1920s. I come out of, our church is Southern Baptist, even though we have fun fighting all the time, but we are a Southern Baptist church, but we do it here. We do partner with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is a Southern Baptist mission sending organization that's still affirm women in ministry. So the CBF is basically Southern Baptists who just affirm women in ministry. We have others here. Beth Moore left the Southern Baptist Convention in a very controversial way because of the more partisan kind of divide and the fact that she was preaching and received a lot of hate mail because of that. And then more recently, Rick Warren of the largest Southern Baptist church, one of the largest Baptist churches in North America, Saddleback, Rick Warren, many of you might have read The Purpose-Driven Church, ordained several women in the last 2 years. And the SBC is threatening to kick them out, but again, they give a lot of missions money, so we're going to see. And then one of my local hero churches is Christ Fellowship. Christ Fellowship, Tom Mullins' son, I forget his name. What's Tom's son? You know him? Tom Mullins' son became pastor and ordained his wife as co-pastor. So to me, that's wonderful progress. Christ Fellowship is not a Baptist church, by the way, but they're over here, a satellite church. They're out of Palm Beach Gardens. All right, I know I'm out of time, so let me wrap it up. I just want to talk just briefly about the consequences of a theological infrastructure that subjugates women. If you continue to write, preach, and build a theology that makes women second class, then it only takes a couple steps to make them second-class citizens. And this past year, we saw that the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee covered up over 700 cases of sexual abuse in which victims were pushed out of church or silenced because primarily of a theology that tells women that they're to be silent, that they're not to have places of leadership. If you continue to leave women out of the room, things like what happened at the Southern Baptist Convention or the Boy Scouts or the Catholic Church will continue to happen. It is if you build a theology that does not give women a voice equally at the table, then they become your objects to do so. And we could tell you stories about that in our own life. Christina grew up in a church in which there was abuse taking place. Thank you so much. And that's not to mean that the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is kind of my own tribe, there's no sexual abuse there, because there's sexual abuse everywhere, but it's not a theological, it's not theologically reinforced. All right, I guess I can keep talking about this. This is one of my hearts for ministry. Women ministry and the sanctity of life are my two kind of passions for ministry, and I can be here all day, but thank